You are listening to the Mobile Payments Today podcast, episode 10. One newsletter brings you the world of money. The World of Money newsletter is a skimmable daily summary of payments and financial technology news from around the globe, covering trends and technologies in banking, fintech, transactions, blockchain, security, mobile, and more. Sign up now at worldofmoney.com.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of the Mobile Payments Today podcast. I am your host and the editor of Mobile Payments Today, Will Hernandez. So first things first, you're going to notice that the audio on this intro sounds a little bit weird, but the reason is I'm doing this on a smartphone, and the reason why that's the case is because I had sent the file to our team down in Louisville, and the file did not take. And I'm in Chicago right now for our Bank Customer Experience Summit. So sometimes you have to do what you have to do to get the podcast out. So again, apologies for the audio, but we'll be back with the regular recording next week. But on that note, it's funny that we're already at 10 episodes of this podcast. And as I've mentioned before, this was something that was a long time coming, probably about 3 years. But sometimes it takes having the right people in place to make it happen. So shout out to John Vincent, Paige Hobbs, and Brittany Warren down at our Networld headquarters in Louisville for making something like this happen and for dealing with audio issues such as this week. But there really isn't a whole lot going on this week because, again, for one thing, I am in Chicago right now for our Bank Customer Experience Summit, and I'll have a breakdown of that summit on next week's episode. Meantime, news is a bit slow because I think companies at the moment are holding off on any big news until Money 2020 next month. And this is something that happens every year. A lot of payments companies wait until everyone, media included, is assembled in Vegas for this thing. And then we get hit with an avalanche of news in the 4 days that we're there. And it's very overwhelming, but it can also be fun at times as well. So in lieu of the news this week, I wanted to give you an observation/rant on something that came to mind while I was sitting in the rain Sunday at MetLife Stadium watching the Giants lose their home opener to the Jaguars. And it's something that plays into our guest and conversation for this week's episode. So for all the talk about cashless societies, we still have the stadium vendors accepting only cash as payments. And the thing that boggles my mind about this is that it happens at stadiums that have huge advertising agreements with companies like Visa and First Data. And a company like First Data has a big agreement with the Mets in New York City. There's a lot of First Data signage throughout the Citi Field where the Mets play. The Mets actually a couple of years ago renamed their primary spring training stadium First Data Field. And every food stand at Citi Field actually does have a Clover POS, but the vendors still only take cash. And I'm often left wondering, why is that the case? You would think you would want these vendors carrying around less cash on them. Now, I'm not sure if there's some logistical reason why vendors are cash only, but when I'm at a Mets game, a Giants game, or a New York City Football Club game like I was on Saturday, it's a noticeable thing for me. I wonder how much more money a team could make in concession sales if those vendors carry some kind of mobile POS. Now, when you're sitting in the club seats in some stadiums, the servers have a way to capture orders on a mobile device of some sort. But usually with those club seats, your food is already included in the price you pay for the ticket. At least I know that's the case at a place like Yankee Stadium. Yes, I'm a Mets fan, but I do occasionally go to Yankee games. That's when I get free tickets. And that was the case in this situation. But anyway, when it comes to that scenario, all you have to do is input your order in the device and the food is delivered to your seat. I know some stadiums right now are experimenting, with mobile food ordering at stadiums, and that's a great thing. It's great to innovate and it's great to add this technology to the stadium experience. But I do think overall, the mobile food vendor, which is what they are, it's a staple of the stadium experience. It's a staple of the arena experience. And I think it's about time technology matches that experience. And on that note, my guest this week is Ankit Kumar, who is the Marketing and Business Development Manager at Gemalto. Ankit and I get into a conversation about the Cashless Society, the security behind it, and how smart cities are playing a role in us ditching cash. So that's going to do it for the intro. Stick around for the Q&A, and I'll be back right after this break.
Welcome back to the Mobile Payments Today podcast. I am here with my guest this week, and that is Ankit Kumar, and he is in business development and the marketing manager specializing in digital payments and mobile financial services at Gemalto. And Ankit, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me, Will.
Appreciate it. And listen, this topic that we're about to dive into here is one that is constantly discussed these days, and I'm talking about just the idea of this cashless society. And I might not be a fan of it necessarily for a few reasons, but I think that it's something that is inevitable. But where do we stand on this idea in 2018 with the cashless society, particularly here in the U.S.?
Well, the way I look at it, there are obvious indicators that cashless transactions are gaining momentum globally. And part of this has to do with the fact that many of the developing countries are increasing the coverage of population to which have a bank account now. But in addition to that, there are other factors like introduction of regulatory framework, PSD2 in Europe. There are a lot of innovative solutions being pushed into the market. With all sorts of digital wallets coming in, you see a launch of more and more digital wallets into the market, and these kind of wallets are trying to solve the acceptance problem to an extent. And if you talk about US more specifically, the volume of cashless transaction in US is relatively high as compared to global figures. But lately there has been an upward trend because more and more industry players are now focusing on making it more convenient for the end user to use cashless channels by offering a smoother experience, and in some cases also providing additional services like order ahead or access to loyalty program. Overall, I'd say I'm quite optimistic.
I know that you're under the belief that we have a lot of stakeholders in this ecosystem, that they're going to need to come together to make choices aimed at encouraging consumer uptake rather than retaining control of cashless payments. What exactly does that mean to you and to us in general in the industry, and how do you think we're going to get there?
You see, in payment ecosystem, there are multiple players, banks, merchants, in some cases even device makers or third party, which are interacting with the consumer in a certain way when a payment transaction is performed. Now, each of these players are tied together with a common goal, that is to see more and more transactions go through. In order to do that, stakeholders need to ensure that there is a frictionless experience for the consumer, and then there's some sort of incentive for them to pick a cashless channel over cash. Merchants and banks can offer some kind of reward program or some value-added services, as we spoke about in the previous question. As we see more and more increase of mobile commerce, you see there's an important role of device maker in offering payment services that works across the devices. And last but not the least, everybody in the ecosystem has to make sure there's adequate security around the payment transaction. In an ideal world, the way I see it, payment transaction should be as simple as a user identifying themselves, and everything else should work in the background.
Let's talk about that security part there for a minute, and I know that seems to be important going forward in this conversation. Are you seeing that now with the stakeholders? Do you think that they're putting?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, this is also supported by some of the regulatory framework which are coming into the market. So PSD2 is a very good example there, which, endorse strong security standards for all the ecosystem players. This kind of gives the confidence to end user, to the consumer, so that they can rely on these cashless channels. One of the biggest concern for consumer is the security. So if that problem is solved by the regulatory standards or by industry players, it's going to help bring a cashless transaction to a higher volume.
In terms of smart cities, and I know this is something that we hear talked about and discussed a lot these days, especially as more things become digital. And I think that you're under the impression that these smart cities are going to play a role in the cashless conversion. And how do you think that's going to happen right now? What do you see happening in that area with smart cities and cashless society?
Well, in my opinion, there are two important factors that can be assisted by smart cities. And first one is security. We just spoke about that. Smart cities can address the security concern of the consumer by putting in place some regulatory framework for strong and robust security standards. This is going to foster confidence for consumer in the payment channels. And again, PSD2 is a very good example here. Second factor is interoperability. Smart cities can promote interoperable standards so that the payment instrument can be accepted by all the merchants alike. And we can look at China as an example here, where payment services like WeChat and Alipay are accepted by even the smallest street side vendor. Such kind of service would definitely reduce consumer reliance on cash.
In terms of actual smart cities right now, I know Toronto is a city that comes up often in this discussion. Is that a good example? Are there other examples out there in terms of what cities are doing to make themselves more digital and more smart per se?
Yes, globally. So Toronto is a good example. Then we can have some example from the Nordic countries. So Norway, Sweden, Finland, all of these countries are moving very aggressive towards being a cashless society. And what they are doing is really facilitating the merchants, even the smallest one, so that they can accept a cashless transaction. As long as a consumer has a confidence that when they go out and do some transaction with the merchant, they will be able to survive without cash. This is really going to promote the culture or the cultural shift within the consumer, so that they can start to rely on cashless channels more often than cash. And this is kind of going to break the habit. So smart cities have a very important role to play there to facilitate all the ecosystem player to make sure that it is supported everywhere and there's adequate security around it.
I know we mentioned security being a factor with consumers. Do you think in general that consumers are ready to embrace this and that they are ready to embrace this idea of a cashless society?
Consumer are definitely ready, but at the moment their concern really is on the security side of it, and regular consumer or layman does not really understand the security standard being put in place behind it. So they trust the entities which are saying, so if let's say a government organization or a smart city comes and tell the consumer that I endorse this solution, that this is secure enough for you and you can use it for your financial transaction. If that kind of endorsement comes into the picture, then this is definitely going to increase the confidence of consumer into the payment channel. So that's where the smart cities have a very important role to play, to educate the consumer that the security is being put in place by the industry stakeholder, and somehow to endorse it or to certify it in a way so that end user or consumer can trust it.
Okay, Ankit. Well, listen, thanks for taking the time this week to join us. I really appreciate it, and I am sure that we will be talking about this topic somewhere down the road. Thanks for joining us. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Mobile Payments Today podcast. Thanks again to Ankit for coming onto the podcast this week to talk about the Cashless Society and Gemalto's role in it. Don't forget that next week I'll have a recap of the Bank Customer Experience Summit, and we promise to get back to having that weekly Editor's Corner the following week. I'll ask you to rate, review, and subscribe to the show on the podcast platform of your choice. Again, as I said in the past, we're on all the major platforms now, including Apple Podcasts, and your feedback would be greatly appreciated on there. If you want to follow us on Twitter, we're over at MobilePayToday. Again, that is at MobilePayToday. And if you want to follow me there as well, I'm over at W_Hernandez16. Again, that is at W_Hernandez16. And just be prepared to read complaints about the Giants for the next 16 weeks on there. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again here next week.